My name is Eugene Delgadio. I'm president of Public Advocate. I'm grateful that I could have with me today a great American, someone who has served his country, has been at war defending our country and defending our freedom during the Vietnam War. He flew 259 combat missions. He is decorated for those sacrifices and he was wounded. He came back and he served in the U.S. military as a legal officer, as a prosecutor, as a member of the JAG force. I'm going to ask Senator Black, our guest today, Senator Richard Black of Virginia, a few questions, but more on Senator Black. He is alone in our country and in our world, the man who speaks the truth. Since his career in the military, he's been fearlessly taking on corruption. He's been taking on corruption among the communists and in the United States foreign policy. He's pointed out that there are people who do defend Christians in our world, and he recognizes them no matter what lies you hear in the media. He's distinguished himself in the area of foreign policy on Ukraine, and his videos have been seen by millions of people. There's no question that the world media knows about Senator Black, so I'm extremely fortunate to bring him here today to talk about a different kind of corruption. The widespread corruption that is going on without apology by these groomers throughout the country. And I want to start out with this question to Senator Black. Senator Black, thank you for being here today. And
thank you, Eugene. It's good to be with you, and I appreciate all the work that you do to try to keep this country on a straight course.
Today's topic is the corruption of children going on in this country. And you know, you have people who have taken positions against this and for it and so on. You have the leftists and you have the conservatives. But I believe, since you have fearlessly defended our country in military service and in foreign policy positions, and you've been very brave in taking on the school board in Loudoun County and very forthright, you also exposed the rape of a child, a rape of a young lady, and brought it to the attention of the national media and mobilized the entire country to take a stand against gender corruption in our schools. And for that, I would like to know a little more about you. We give ourselves an opportunity here to discuss your background and your opinions about gender corruption. What gives you your worldview and your experience, Senator Black?
You know, I've always had a tremendous interest in cultural affairs, military affairs, foreign affairs. When I was a boy, I was 6, 7, 8, 10 years old, and I had a brilliant father. He was a special agent for Internal Revenue Service, very conservative. His brother, my uncle, was a very, very brilliant man who was very liberal. He was a socialist. He was a very extreme socialist. And we would get together because they're two brothers. They love one another very much. And we would discuss things, cultural matters, foreign affairs, the politics of the day, military things. And so as a little boy, I would just listen. I was the observer. And they would talk, but unlike what you see on TV where you have people interrupting and screaming at each other and yelling things, it was a very deliberate conversation where you would hear the liberal position articulated very effectively, and then you would hear the conservative position articulated very effectively. And so it gave me a foundation for all of these things and a great interest in them. Now, I grew up when America was a very strong country morally. It was a very good, decent place. And one of the things that all children learned as they were growing up, boys especially, boys learned that, watch out for strange men in the bathroom. And you weren't a half decent parent if you didn't caution your sons and say, keep an eye out, watch out for these things. So we used to have vice squads back then. And the purpose of a vice squad wasn't to put people in prison for 100 years. The purpose of it was to suppress vice, whether it was prostitution, homosexuality, drug use, and the vice squads would go out and they would write these people up, and they'd be taken into court, and it would sort of drive this stuff underground to where it was less of a problem culturally. So when I was a teenage boy, there were a small number of people in Florida who grew up as snake hunters, and we would go out in the Everglades, and back then the Everglades were very, very wild, very remote. We didn't have cell phones, we didn't have pay phones, we didn't have anything. And you would go out and you were on your own. If you got in trouble, you better sort it out or you weren't coming back. That's just how simple it was. And so we would go out and we'd hunt for poisonous snakes. And so we were not well off, and so my buddy and I would hitchhike out to the glades, and this one time we had a wonderful day. We waded through the swamps where the alligators are prowling, and cottonmouth water moccasins are slithering around on mats of hay, and they'd slip into the water and you didn't know where they were. They were down there somewhere and you were up to your waist in water. And anyway, we had a good day. We caught 3 or 4 big, fat, heavy-bodied water moccasins, venomous water moccasins. So we're hitchhiking back, and the deal was always that the guy with the snakes sat in the back. He'd slip back there, and the guy who did the hitching, he would be in the front. So I was the guy in the front. So this fellow picked us up. He was a grown man. We were just little boys, and I think he had figured, well, I got myself some little boys, and I'm gonna attack them. And so he took off. He floored the car to where he went screaming along, so we couldn't jump out of the car. And he grabbed for me, and he started trying to fondle me. Well, I started to fight. I don't think he expected that. Little boys are not supposed to fight grown men. And so he's backhanding me, but he's driving with one hand while he's doing this, and I'm fighting him, and I'm pushing him, and all of this. And while I'm doing that, my buddy is in the back seat, and he's untying the knot on this long feed sack that we kept the snakes in.
Wow.
And so he's doing all of that, and it's sort of in the back of my mind. I'm irritated, thinking, how come my buddy's not helping me fight this jerk?
He was busy.
So he was busy. So anyway, finally, the homosexual fellow realized that he wasn't going to pull this off. So he puts on the brakes, he pulls over to the side. I jumped out and I slammed the door, and I'm just furious. And my buddy slams his door. And so the guy stomps on the accelerator and he roars down the road. And I turned to my buddy, I said, can you believe that guy? And I was just shaking with fury. And my buddy, he was a very funny guy.
Dry wet?
And he had long, slick back blonde hair. He later became a lead guitarist in a rock band. That's what he did for a living. But anyway, he looks at me and he's grinning. Well, that just made me even madder. And then I look down, and he has the empty snake sack in his hand. And I said, Russ, where are the snakes?
Where are the snakes?
And he just silently, he points over the horizon where the car's driving off, and he had this silent laugh. And so this guy took off down the road.
Karma.
With big, heavy-bodied, poisonous water moccasins slithering on the floorboards. And I suspect the next time he went to the gay bar, he said, got a little advice: never pick up a Florida snake hunter. So anyway, so I had personal experience with these guys. Now, later on, I was in the Pentagon. Went to the Pentagon in 1992.
You're a little older.
Yes, I mean, this is, I'm grown by this time. I'm middle-aged, and I'm nearing retirement in the military. And Bill Clinton was elected president, and he despised the military. He hated soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines. And so before he was sworn in, he went to the Vietnam Wall, and he made an announcement that he was going to put notorious homosexuals into the military. And when he did, I just went berserk. And I sat down in my office, I typed up a notice, and everything that I always did, I was always strictly within the law and the regulation. But I typed up a notice, and it said, as a member of the U.S. military, you are entitled to contact your congressmen, your senators, about any matter, including gays in the military. And here are the phone numbers. And I printed those up. You know how big the Pentagon is? It has, at the time, 26,000 people who were there, 5 stories, and it's this immense, it was, and I think still is, the largest office building ever constructed. And so I went and I walked all rings. You have the A ring through the E ring, going from the inner to the outer, and it's miles around. When you do this, it's miles. And then you do that on each level. And I went to every level, and every bulletin board, I put up one of these signs. I'd go into all the men's rooms, and in every stall, I had the notice put up there. They only lasted a couple of days, but I'll tell you what, it sent a shock wave through the Department of Defense, and people knew that this was going to be a battle to the end. So this went on, and gradually it evolved where I was very outspoken against gays in the military. I knew a great deal about the subject, and it sort of reached a crescendo when we had the Worldwide JAG Conference. We had senior DOD officials and people from all the services, about 800 of the top military officials.
Now, JAG is, what does that stand for?
JAG is the military lawyers, and it's the Judge Advocate General's Corps. In the Army, for example, we had 1,600 military lawyers.
And you're one of 1,600 military lawyers.
One of 1,600, but I was one of the full colonels, and there's sort of a small group of full colonels who tend to run the JAG Corps. So I was one of the plenary speakers who was to address the full conference, and there was a wonderful sociologist, Charlie Moscos. He's passed away, but he was hired by the military to do studies of the impact of gays in the military. What would this mean if we brought people who regularly engaged in homosexual sodomy into the military? And so he gave a presentation, it was a balanced presentation. And then he asked the question, he said, "What do all of you think?" Well, there always are a few people who, they've got their finger to the wind. And so one of them raised his hand, and he said, "Look," he said, "I work at at NATO-shaped headquarters in Brussels. He said, we don't have a problem with showers and things like this. When we get a shower, we get a nice bathrobe, and we go into a private stall. He says, it's never been a problem. And I was so angered when he said that. Here again, this is a very large conference room filled to the brim. And I jumped to my feet, and I have a very loud voice when I get really angry. And I bellowed across the room at him, and I won't repeat the words that I said verbatim, but the gist of it was, well, I fought in the 1st Marine Division, and we didn't have any such and such little robes and such little stalls. We were out in the jungles, and I'm going to tell you, if we do this, it's going to ruin the United States military. Well, after that, people were so stunned by the vehemence with which I went after this, because it was very important. No one dared to speak a word in favor of gays in the military for the rest of the week-long conference. There was never a whisper of it. And so from the very beginning, we captured the initiative from the people who were promoting sodomy in the military. And so I have a very, very extensive background. I studied homosexuality for about 18 months during this extensive battle. I was meeting with the staff for Senator Sam Nunn, a very fine Democrat. There were some good Democrats in those days. And I was working with the Republican Study Group. And so we were on the front line. So this gave me the background to deal with what we faced here in Loudoun County with the public schools.
So the big issue today, and this is trending on Twitter every day this week and for several years now, this topic of grooming. Grooming, we're not saying that all homosexuals want children, and we're not saying that all homosexuals attack men, right? But there is a certain group of people who are homosexual who do want children, just as there are sexually heterosexual people, boys, that want men that want boys. So how do you address the distinction? You're aware that there are pedophiles versus just homosexuals.
Well, I'm aware of it. I know that it is a very large movement within the homosexual community. This is not a small group. It's not a minor segment of it. It is a major and very dominant portion of it. They control the narrative, and for example, they have as one of their long-term goals reducing the age of consent to 13 for little boys. The reason for this is that usually when you have a rape, a homosexual rape, it's a one-on-one swearing match. So you have one articulate adult homosexual versus one young, frightened, nervous little boy, and it's very easy to overcome and to create a burden, a reasonable doubt under those circumstances.
So you have addressed the issue, the distinction, that there is a large group of homosexuals. Now, from your experience, that are preying on boys, and there are, and I want you to comment on this, are there lesbians preying on girls as well?
Yes, there are, and one of the places that they are most dominant, and I would say, I would just guess that a majority of the drill instructors in military service are lesbians. Now that's a guess, so I could be wrong, but I know from talking with various women who have come through the enlisted ranks that the lesbian element tends to be drawn to boot camps. because here you have an older woman. Now everything's relative. Older in the military may be 25 to 30, okay? But you're dealing with girls who often are 18, 19 years old. So she's in a position where she is dominant, she is able to control, she has enormous influence, and there is a tremendously virulent strain of anti-Christianity within military boot camps today, particularly with the women's boot camps, because it ties in with the lesbianism, with the biblical scripture, not only Christian but also within Islam and other religions. Very, very direct in its condemnation of sodomy, same-sex relations. And so there tends to be, at least among the lesbians in the boot camps, this desire to undermine girls' belief in Christian values, and at the same time to groom them and to encourage them to sort of get with it, go along with the girls who perhaps are involved with a little drugs, and who start playing around with other lesbian activities. So it is a very significant problem.
Now, a lot of what we've talked about, you're breaking here for the first time, and I'm grateful if you're still watching, but we are breaking new ground here. You're, as a JAG officer, you prosecuted a lot of these crimes without revealing any proprietary information that's in the interest of the United States and your other oath of office, which goes with you no matter where you go. But are you allowed to discuss some of your real observances directly as a JAG officer in the prosecution of the rapes of young military men or young military women by these homosexuals?
Yes, because one of the things that was very favorable to us during the time that I was able to block Bill Clinton from imposing gays in the military, we finally won that battle. And we blocked him for 17 years until we had Obama come in. But something that strengthened our hand was that trial records are public records. They're public documents. And so we were able to research through records of trials by courts-martial and go through those and determine which were homosexual crimes, which were just ordinary crimes. Because you can, under Article 125 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, the crime of sodomy is prohibited. Now, you can have a sodomy committed between a man and a woman, or you can have one between two men. You can have one between two women. However, what you've got to do if you want to do that is you've got to go through all of the records of trial by court-martial. You single out certain crimes like Article 125 sodomy, and then you have to go through trial by trial and examine each one and determine what the circumstances were and whether it amounts to a homosexual sodomy or whether it's one of these others.
And you were able to observe that through your research as an attorney, that a preponderance of these cases were assaults on others, on straight people? Were there rapes occurring of straight people?
Yes, there were a great number of them. And now keep in mind, back at the time that I was doing
they've talked about rapes of women, but they have lumped it together now with the lesbians assaulting women, and they've ignored the rapes on men that are occurring today. But we have you here, so that's why I'm asking about, well, what was it like during your time? Were there hundreds of rapes that were today would be unreported, for example?
Well, you know, there has always been a movement to blur the lines so that you'll often hear a police report and they'll say, today, you know, Mr. Smith or Mr. Suarez was picked up for a sexual assault on a child. Well, immediately your question of any rational person is, was this child a boy or a girl? Now, it's not to say that a man sexually assaulting a girl isn't a terrible, terrible offense, but it's different. And you learn different things from knowing, is it a girl, is it a boy? You want to know the details, you want to understand. It's normal human instinct to want to know what are the facts, but they're screened so that people will not understand the frequency with which you have very violent assaults of particularly men on boys. Now there is violence with women, with the lesbians, but it's much less frequent. Interestingly, you know, we always hear, well, lynching, this lynching, this lynching. The only lynching that I experienced in a full 32-year career in the Marines of the Army was one that happened to involve lesbians. And as I recall, none of them were black. I think they were all white or Hispanic. And what you had is you had one of these very strange things where a group of lesbians became angered at one of their members, and they took her out in the woods and they strung her up, just hanged her and left her body hanging there. But that was very exceptional, it was very unique, and the thing that makes it most interesting is that with all this unending discussion of lynchings, that happens to be the only lynching that I ever experienced in 32 years. And it wasn't a racial lynching, it was something that occurred between lesbians.
Well, I wanted to just, again, conclude on the military side of it. And so you have a background on the military side from active representation and investigation and prosecution, and that gave you your background. Today, there is gender confusion among children, according to the leftists. Are there groomers? Who is the force behind the gender corruption that's going on, the recruiting, the grooming? Or is it just liberals, leftists who want to educate people about their sexual preference without consequence? Is it something we should tolerate?
You know, this started, this movement towards the sexual grooming of children. It's been going on for a long time, but it received a tremendous impetus from the Supreme Court's case of Lawrence versus Texas. When Lawrence versus Texas was decided in 2003, as far as I know, every state had laws against homosexual behavior. And they varied from state to state, but basically they were designed to suppress homosexuality and to keep it out of public places, to keep children safe from it. Now, because of Lawrence versus Texas,
Right, now, Lawrence versus Texas is different from, quote, the Oberfeld decision, which took away one man, one woman marriage. Could you tell us a little bit more about that case? I'm familiar with the case. I know that Ted Cruz was the Solicitor General for 6 months there and didn't get involved in that case.
yes. So Lawrence versus Texas basically swept away all of the laws prohibiting consensual sodomy, between homosexuals. Made it far, far more difficult to prosecute the homosexual rape of a little boy, which was very common, goes on all over the country.
Did it also impact that charge of sodomy on a woman? In other words, it also impacted heterosexual rape as well. They would commit you a sex crime, but
no. Well, what it was, under Lawrence versus Texas, Lawrence versus Texas affected consensual sodomy.
I see.
So if it was forcible sodomy, whether it was homosexual, whether it was heterosexual, it could still be prohibited. But here's the way that it worked. You suddenly made it extremely difficult to prosecute the assault, say, on a Boy Scout. Now, during my research in the Pentagon, we weren't even researching for this and just happened to run across 4 individual cases where soldiers had infiltrated the Boy Scouts and raped little boys. Now, it was very easy to prosecute because little boys couldn't consent, and so you got a conviction. But now with Lawrence versus Texas, and particularly with the homosexual movement driving down the age of consent, you found yourself in this situation where you had a young teenage boy who was technically able to consent to sex, and then you'd have this very smooth-talking, articulate homosexual who would say, "Oh yes, the boy wanted some money. He came to me looking for money. I said, okay," and he got what he wanted. Well, of course, then the little boy is terrified. Many of them would refuse to testify. It's very humiliating. They would have to go on the stand and testify. And then they'd be cross-examined and they would be accused of doing this stuff. So suddenly the Supreme Court made it very difficult to successfully prosecute forcible sodomy on little boys. So this was very important. The movement continues gaining steam because now the homosexual is becoming more and more powerful. And in 2015, that's when the Supreme Court ruled in Obergefell versus Hodges. Now the people of America, the ordinary people, understood that things were headed in a very bad direction in this country. And so across the nation, state to state, the states began to amend their constitutions to define marriage as the union of one man and one woman. And so, for example, here in Virginia, Delegate Bob Marshall and I teamed up. We co-patroned a bill, and it took a couple of years to get this through. It's a very complex thing to amend the Constitution. You have to pass it twice with an intervening election, and then you have to put it to a vote of the people. 60% of the states in the United States followed that process and amended their Constitution. And that was when the Supreme Court stepped in and said, we better make this the law of the land, or soon every state in the country is going to define marriage as one man and one woman. And so that was the importance of Obergefell and the disaster that it created.
Now, I have another question for you. Are children being manipulated into this gender confusion right now by lesbian teachers, or are teachers adopting these programs, adopting the ideological agenda for critical race theory and gender confusion, and coming out on Twitter, coming out on their TikTok, their social media, and they're actually confessing? You know, I've told my kindergarten class, I've told my first grade class, I've told my second grade class. I mean, one gentleman in Michigan just testified at a school board meeting on Monday, and then Tuesday he's picked up for soliciting sex from a 14-year-old boy. He's a proud member of the LGBT community, and then on the following day he's picked up for soliciting sex from a little boy. So what is going on with this gender confusion? Is it ideological, persuading of little people, little children, over the parents' objections for political reasons, or is it for self-interest? Are these pedophiles in name? Are they actual pedophiles, or are they pushing this agenda of having sex with children for some other reason that I haven't been able to figure out other than the obvious?
Well, there are a combination of reasons. What you began to see with Lawrence versus Texas and Obergefell versus Hodges is suddenly the U.S. government was endorsing sodomy. Obergefell in particular, where the Supreme Court ordered every state to begin issuing marriage licenses. Now, they had no authority to do this, but under the U.S. Constitution, the biggest single weakness in the Constitution is the absence of checks and balances, effective checks and balances on the Supreme Court. Now, back in the 50s, you had the Earl Warren Court, and Earl Warren and a group of predominantly liberal justices realized suddenly, wait a minute, we've got the power. Sure, we're supposed to just interpret cases, but we can take any case that comes up. We can twist it any way we want. We can issue decrees. We can make laws, not just interpret laws. We can make laws, and nobody can second guess us. And they began to do it. They began to do it in a very aggressive way. And so what happens, they say in Obergefell, we overrule 60% of all of the people of America, and we decree that there will be same-sex marriages. And because of this, the next thing you have is you start having principals of high schools who are engaged in sodomy publicly, outspokenly, and all of a sudden they're in a position where nobody can touch them. They do whatever they want. So what do? They go to a big conference where they have all of the children in the school. Maybe it's an awards convention or something.
A school assembly.
The school assembly. And here the principal of the school, a man, introduces his wife, or his, what, I don't know what you call it.
Partner.
His partner. Some guy, some swarthy looking, slimy guy. And says, okay, this is what marriage is. Or you have a woman, as often this happens, you have a woman says, oh, I want you to introduce my wife. Well, women don't have wives, but now the Supreme Court has said, okay, women are going to have wives, men are going to have husbands. And so this affects children. Children look and say, okay, I guess the law says this is okay. So they're being indoctrinated by the federal courts and the state courts, which follow them. At the same time, you have these teachers, very radical teachers, increasing in numbers all the time, always recruiting more and more teachers to join their ranks, teaching in the public schools. And they go up and they put up a rainbow sodomy flag. And everybody knows what it is. This is the flag that stands for anal sodomy. And they say, well, we're having a Pride Month. Well, pride in what? Pride in sodomy? And you can see there's a zero-sum game with Christianity. Now, they're not so interested in other religions, even though, for example, Islam is very anti sodomy, but their focus is on breaking and shattering the cohesion of the nation. And the largest group within the nation that must be shattered is the Christians. So it's not a give and take. It is a zero-sum game. To the extent that sodomy wins, Christianity loses, because there is nothing more explicitly condemned in Scripture than sodomy. You have the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, where the cities are absolutely destroyed and every human being and every animal within them killed because of God's wrath towards sodomy. You have many references. You have them in the New Testament. You've got them in the Old Testament. You have Jesus talking about anyone who would mislead one of these little ones had better be taken out in the ocean and have a millstone tied around his neck, be thrown into the ocean, than to mislead these little ones. And many people have interpreted that as referring specifically to the homosexuals. But in any event, you have this, to some extent, you have people who are active pedophiles, lots of them, in the ranks, within the schools, within the teachers. Now not all of them, you have others who are simply very radical, Marxist-leaning individuals who are homosexual, who have just a hatred towards our culture, our constitution, our religion, and they combine this critical race theory where they teach children to have a hatred for white children, sometimes a hatred towards Asian children, and they actively promote racial hatred, and they intertwine it because by promoting the rainbow sodomy flag, by promoting sodomy, they are able to attack Christianity. Sometimes it's a little bit subtle. Sometimes they're very forthright about what they're doing. But so you have an ideological element, and you also have you have teachers who are titillated by teaching this stuff.
Now, in Florida, they have outlawed the use of sexual terms to children. In Texas, they have made it a criminal act to recommend chemical or biological or butchering of children for the purposes of changing their sex. There are 17 states that are protecting girls in high school and college and grammar school not being violated by men in their bathrooms or men or boys coming into these sports. There is a struggle in this country to deal with this pedophilia rage or this pedophilia grooming on a massive scale that's in all over the country in every state. What are some solutions besides the Florida, Texas, and all these states taking it? There are candidates for president saying we're going to end right now there's a review period for Title IX that President Biden has proposed, changing Title IX throughout the country all at once to essentially order the schools to promote the transgender philosophy, which is to allow men into the bathrooms and into the girls' rooms and men into girls' sports.
One of the tragedies of all of this is women's sports. I enjoy watching women's sports. I like watching the Olympics, the gymnastics. It's a very beautiful art for girls. But I can remember back in the days of the old Soviet Union, the United States routinely would single out individual Soviet athletes and challenge them and say, this is not a girl. This is not a girl. This is actually a man. And a lot of times they successfully did it. And it was a good thing. Because if you have a woman who is very accomplished as an athlete, a gymnast, whatever it happens to be, people like that. They enjoy seeing women be successful at gymnastics. They don't want to see some dude who walks out and, some hairy-faced guy with a penis and he walks out and he says, well, look at me. I can run faster than she can, or I can do this or that. Because that's nothing. Let him compete with other men. He may be mentally aberrant, but he's still a man. Let him compete with the men. Don't let him take advantage of the women. The other day we had a news article where these transgendered, they have a right in certain states to be moved into a gender of their choice in a prison cell.
Yes.
So men are saying, okay, I'm a girl. I want to be put in there with the ladies. They're put in, and the next thing, they voluntarily or through force, they impregnate the women. There was a story of one of these fellows.
And the transgender prisoner was transferred to a men's prison, and he's complaining about the conditions in that jail.
Yes.
They're not the same as the jail where he was raping the women.
Yeah.
So what a shock. We've been talking about teachers. We've been talking about the general culture. We kind of skirted around Disney, but there is a group of adults, men who dress up as drag queens, and they're on the road, and they're going all over the place. They're in the streets, they're in libraries, they're going wherever they're welcome that they're going, and they're having events at bars for children. So it seems to me public corruption gone amok. What is your thinking on that? Why is that legal?
Yeah, let me just sidetrack a moment and say there is no such thing as a transgender. It's a cross-dresser, okay? Because there is no such thing. I can't become another gender, and a woman can't become another gender. They can dress differently. They can conduct surgical operations and that type of thing, but they're never transgender. You can't change your gender. J. Edgar Hoover was fairly well known to be a cross-dresser. He liked to be a cross-dresser. Who knows how many people he might have forced to submit to him over the years. The guy was totally immoral. But anyway, that's off to the side. Now let me talk about the
drag queens.
What's going on with the drag queens.
What's your take on that?
Okay, just recently they had one of these gay pride celebrations in Seattle, and they had men. There were about 10 of them, and I watched the video. 10 men, stark naked, not wearing the slightest thing. And there's a big crowd. There are some of these liberal parents who would bring their children. And these 10 men they just ride in a circle. And of course it titillates them. They're getting their jollies out of having little children look at them walk around naked. And it was interesting because the particular video I watched, there was a girl, and the camera wasn't directed at her, but occasionally you could see her as it panned around. And she was probably 12 years old, nice looking little girl, and you could see the anguish in her face. Children know this stuff is abnormal. They're not taught that it's abnormal. They understand abnormality from birth. It's designed into a person's brain. That's the way you're born. The day that you're born, you understand it. A 2-year-old child looks, and one of the first things they ever say, they say, "Look, mommy, boy. Look, mommy, girl." Nobody has to teach a 2-year-old child what a boy and a girl is. They know it instinctively. And so what happens now? we have the drag queens. You have these men, they dress up as women, but they dress up very often in these hideous, bizarre, frightening, scary looking costumes. Now, there are a lot of children, they're afraid of skeletons, or they're afraid of clowns, or some kids, some kids are very frightened by Santa Claus. And so if you see a child who's frightened to sit on Santa's knee, you take them away and you say, okay, you don't have to do this. This was for fun. If it's not fun for you, fine. Well, Santa and a skeleton and all these things are very mild compared to the drag queen. The drag queens are deliberately hideous. These men love to shock and to damage these children psychically and to leave them stunned. For some reason, it gives these guys a sexual pleasure to be able to hurt these children, and they can't touch them openly in the schools, but they can stun them. And they know that the children are looking, and they know how deeply immoral and how deeply abnormal this is, and yet there's the confusion because their teacher is saying this is fine. The school is condoning it, and it's a hideous thing, so it is something that needs to be purged from every public school and every private school in this country, and I think we've got to start on it. I think people are beginning to get fed up and said, we're not going to have our children groomed so that pedophiles can more easily commit sexual assaults on them. And this is exactly the course that the public schools are following in America today.
And you have been part of that for over several years now. Public Advocate has assisted you, and you have been at the forefront of this fight in Loudoun County. Currently there's a grand jury proceeding, special grand jury. You helped Governor Youngkin become governor so that there could be an executive order creating a special grand jury. This is a wave that took over Virginia, and there are conservatives like yourself who are leading this fight, but you have been very much at the front line of it. We've taken your speeches to the school board, we've taken your speeches at rallies, and we're promoting it on all our platforms, all 20 of our platforms, and we are reaching many hundreds of thousands of people. But we know, Public Advocate knows, that the 2016 election hinged on the exposure of the Barack Obama transgender executive order and its overturning by President-elect Trump as his first executive order. This national election, there are Republicans, there are liberal Republicans who don't want this as an issue. I won't rattle off their names right now. We're in a national election. We're in an opportunity to what I call set the agenda. And we have the presidential elections coming up in 2024, but we also have this national election, congressmen, senators. What do you see as the future? Do you see us setting that agenda today based on the momentum of winning Virginia last year, and this continuing to be a very hard topic for people to articulate on, which is why I asked you to come here today? You obviously don't have a problem talking about it, but what about the Republicans? What about the conservatives? What about our fate in this national election? Should we all just be quiet and let the crazy people protest the judges and burn our cities down, or should we continue engagement on this?
I think right now, conservatives have the initiative. We've been in a situation for so long where we've been swimming upstream. But what's happened is the Supreme Court, and many thanks to Donald Trump for this, because he managed to appoint 3 justices who have done well to some extent or other. But what's happening, if you look at all of their decisions together, they are working to move back to constitutional governance. For ever since the 50s, the 1950s, we have not really been a self-governing people as was envisioned by the founders of the Constitution. We could make little changes, but the Supreme Court was always waiting there with a sharp stick to whack us on the hand. Okay, you have said it's wrong to kill children, well here, okay, we're going to put you back to square one, and it doesn't matter what all of the people of the state say, we're wiping away that law that you've enacted. That's changing. And the Supreme Court, now it's not entirely clear, but it seems that the direction they're moving is to return, first of all, to draw back from the time where they would use court decisions to enact legislation, which was going on. So they're beginning to say, okay, Roe versus Wade had no foundation whatsoever, and so we're doing away with it. And so now we're moving away from making laws, and we're starting to move back to constitutional governance, where we're saying, okay, the bureaucracy cannot make big decisions on things like the environment. We're going to rein in the bureaucracy. At some point, I hope to see that we will resurrect the 10th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which said that the federal government has only certain limited powers and the remainder are with the states. But we'll see how far they go, but there is a movement in this direction. It puts so much power within the American people, because all of a sudden people can go to the polls, they can protest, they can do all of these normal political activities, and they can change things. They won't just be put back to square one, do not pass go, do not collect $200, go to jail. No, that doesn't happen anymore, and all of a sudden it empowers movements of people and movements of pro-family, pro-Christian, pro-life groups. And now, before the question came up, what was one thing that we could do that would have enormous impact? And I'll tell you, there are laws being passed now that prohibit using surgical operations on minors to change their sexual identity, whatever you want to call it. Basically, it's taking the breasts from girls and monkeying around with the genitals of boys, sometimes taking off their sexual organs. The key to ending it is to enact legislation that creates a civil cause of action, that child who is mutilated as a child has a window of opportunity, perhaps 10, 15 years after they reach the age of majority, in which they can file a civil suit for actual damages, punitive damages, attorney's fees and costs, and they can go after anybody who is involved in sexually mutilating them, whether it's a parent, whether it's a teacher, whether it is a doctor. And the reason I speak with such confidence is that I have passed legislation just like this.
Genital mutilation laws.
Now, this deals with female genital mutilation, and it wasn't aimed at this whole so-called transgenderism. It was aimed at a very savage practice that emerges from Africa and the Mideast, and it's come over here with a lot of immigrants. And I was approached by a group of predominantly black women of African and Mideastern origin, and they asked me if I would sponsor legislation to prohibit female genital mutilation. Because what they do in those cultures, some of them, is they will cut out parts of the female genital anatomy so that the woman does not derive sexual pleasure. And in that way, the men are able to dominate the women more completely. So I had an immense struggle getting this through at first. Finally passed it as a misdemeanor. I came back. I upped it to a felony with a punishment of 20 years to life in prison. And then I came back the following year and I created a civil cause of action so that any girl, when she's a child who is mutilated, can file a civil cause of action, and she can bankrupt that doctor, and she can bankrupt that father and that mother who have done this to her. The same thing should be done when it comes to the genital mutilation, when it's done for purposes of this transgender movement. Do that, and all of a sudden, you know how teenagers are. Teenagers tend to be very angry, and people who are in this transgender movement are doubly so. I mean, according to Forbes magazine, 52% of them contemplate suicide every year. I mean, that's in a 1-year frame that over half of them contemplate suicide. So they tend to be very volatile. So what happens when that child who, that girl who has her breast removed when she is, when she's 16 years old, and then she becomes furious at her mother for doing it. And time goes on, and then she's 25 and she says, I am so furious, I'm going to do something. She goes down, she gets a trial lawyer. And she says, look, you know, here's what's happened to me. Here's the doctor who did it. Here's the Uber driver who drove me to the clinic and knew about it, and can identify all these people and go after them. And the next thing, they could end up with an award of $10 million with punitive damages.
Thank you very much. I am just overwhelmed. Of course, we have a major documentary being prepared now by a very well-known documentary videographer. He's done 9 videographies on other topics, including the right to life issue, and he is coming out with a documentary on gender confusion. And we're going to be promoting that on our social platforms. It does have Senator Black as one of the people in it. I'm in it. Many other people are in it. A shout out to Frank. Frank has done a lot of work, and we'll give him a proper recognition. Of course, I retweet all his tweets. But this interview is probably the most spectacular revelation ever. With all due respect, I have been stunned by what I've learned today. Some of the insights, every one of the segments we've just had is just riveting, the detail and the solutions. I want to thank you, Senator, for having the opportunity, giving me the opportunity, giving us the opportunity to hear some of the experiences you've had and some of the ideas you've shared. And of course, your insight and your vision for the future is just eye-opening. Your blunt talk is very much appreciated. Did you have any closing remarks?
Well, Eugene, first I want to thank you for what you're doing. I think it's a tremendous service, and I think a word of hope is that we now are on the move. We're moving forward. The people waving the rainbow sodomy flag are on the back heel. They're in retreat. They're in retreat all over the world. But keep in mind, we have sort of reached a high point, or a low point, I suppose, where the United States has become the only nation in world history to fly the rainbow sodomy flag beneath its national ensign. It is a disgrace. It is a hideous disgrace. I think we need to turn it back. If we don't turn it back, this country is going downhill, and it's going down very fast. But at the same time, I think we can do it. I think we're on the move. I think we can roll it back. Don't forget this idea of a civil action that a child can take after they grow up to go after people who sexually mutilate them through surgery. I think that's important, and I think we've got the tools to work with, and we need to go after it.
I am hopeful that we will be able to. Thank you very much, Senator Black, and thank you all for watching.